You think you've got it rough when your heater breaks down for a day. Let me paint you a picture of what winter was really like back in medieval times. Imagine bone-chilling cold that seeps into your marrow with no modern insulation, no central heating, and death lurking around every corner. The winter months in medieval Europe weren't just uncomfortable, they were a savage battle for survival that claimed countless lives each year. Oh, and if you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. Super curious where you're all listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Always blows my mind how people are falling asleep to this all over the world. All right, let's head back to medieval Europe during the Little Ice Age. Trust me, it's going to be quite a ride. But first, get comfortable. Seriously, adjust those pillows, pull up that blanket, because where we're going, you're going to want to be cozy. So, congratulations. You just woke up in a small village in northern England in the year 1350. The first thing you notice isn't the light. There isn't much of that on this grey November morning. It's the cold, a biting, damp chill that makes your bones ache. Not like your comfy bed right now with its temperature-controlled environment and fluffy duvet. Your eyes flutter open to rough-hewn timber beams overhead, blackened by years of smoke. The air smells of wood smoke, damp straw, and the earthy scent of the cattle penned in the adjacent section of your home. You're lying on a straw-filled mattress set on a simple wooden frame, piled with scratchy woolen blankets and whatever furs your family has managed to acquire. The cold has crept in during the night, and your breath forms small clouds in the dim light. As you roll over, straw crunches beneath you. Your siblings and perhaps a grandparent are huddled nearby for warmth. Outside, the wind whistles through the bare trees, and frost paints delicate patterns on the small, unglazed window openings covered with oiled parchment or wooden shutters. For the family of Thomas Fletcher, this particular morning carried extra weight. It was the feast of St. Martin, November 11th, traditionally marking the true beginning of winter. The last few weeks had been spent in frantic preparation, and now the real test would begin. Thomas sat up on the edge of the bed platform and winced as his feet touched the packed earth floor. At 43, he was considered an old man by medieval standards, and the cold made his joints protest. His wife Emma stirred beside him, but stayed beneath the warm blankets with their youngest daughter. Their son William, 14 and already considered a man, was stoking the remnants of last night's fire in the central hearth. "Looks to be frost again," Thomas said, peering through a crack in the wooden shutters. "Heavy one, too." "The pond was starting to freeze yesterday," William replied, carefully arranging kindling over the glowing embers. "Peter the miller says we're in for a hard winter." Thomas nodded grimly. The last few winters had been brutal. Ever since he was a boy, the winters seemed to be getting longer and colder. What he didn't know was that he was living through what modern historians would later call the Little Ice Age, a period of cooling that gripped Europe from the 14th to the 19th century. For ordinary people like Thomas, this meant shorter growing seasons, unpredictable harvests, and winters that tested the limits of human endurance. The global cooling of about 2 degrees Celsius might not sound like much to our modern ears, but for medieval farmers, it was the difference between life and death. A successful fire was the first victory of each day. Emma joined her husband and son, wrapping a shawl tightly around her shoulders. She added a small log to the now crackling flames, careful not to use too much precious firewood too early in the season. "Margaret!" she called to their eldest daughter, who was still burrowed under the blankets. "Come help with breakfast." The day would be busy. Though the main harvest was complete, St. Martin's Day marked the traditional slaughtering time. Animals that couldn't be fed through the winter would provide meat for the coming months. Nothing would be wasted. Outside, the village was coming alive despite the cold. Smoke rose from the central hearths of each humble home. Most were similar to Thomas's, single-room dwellings with walls of wattle and daub. This construction technique, using woven sticks coated with a mixture of clay, straw, and dung, provided better insulation than you might expect. The thick walls and thatched roofs helped keep warmth in, though the lack of proper chimneys meant the houses were often smoky. The weeks leading up to winter were perhaps the busiest of the year for medieval villagers. Unlike us, who can make a quick trip to the grocery store when supplies run low, medieval people had one shot at preparing for the cold months ahead. Fail in those preparations, and you might not see spring. "William, make sure the woodpile is covered properly," Thomas instructed as they finished their simple breakfast of dark bread and ale. "The wood must stay dry." Firewood was life itself in winter. Each family needed several cords of wood to survive the cold season, and gathering it was a year-round task. Throughout spring, summer, and fall, villagers collected fallen branches and deadwood from the nearby forest. The lord of the manor allowed this by right of Estover, but cutting living trees was forbidden and could bring severe punishment. Some families hadn't gathered enough wood. They would face the grim choice between freezing and breaking the law by cutting green wood, which didn't even burn well. Thomas had seen winters where desperate people burned parts of their own homes for warmth. "Father," William called from outside, "John Cooper wants to know if you'll help with the pig slaughtering today." Thomas nodded. Martinmas, as the feast of St. Martin was known, traditionally marked the time when animals were slaughtered before winter. There simply wasn't enough fodder to keep all the livestock alive through the cold months. Only breeding stock and working animals would be spared. The village's preparations had been ongoing for weeks. Root vegetables had been dug up and stored in cool, dry places. Cabbages were harvested before the frost could claim them. Grains, the staple of medieval diet, had been threshed and stored in vermin-proof containers. Now came the final and most important task: preserving meat for the long, lean months ahead. While Thomas headed to help with the slaughtering, Emma and her daughters faced equally important work. In their small garden plot, they gathered the last hardy herbs, rosemary, thyme, and sage, that would both flavour and help preserve winter foods. The apples had already been picked and stored, with the best specimens carefully wrapped in straw and placed in the coolest corner of the house. Medieval food preservation was an art form born of necessity. Without refrigeration, keeping food edible through winter required multiple strategies. Salt was the most valuable preservative, but it was expensive. The Fletcher family had traded a wool cloak Emma had woven for a precious small sack of salt earlier in the year, saving it specifically for preserving winter meat. "We'll salt half the meat," Emma told Margaret as they worked. "The rest we'll smoke. Make sure the herbs are completely dry before we store them." Salting meat involved rubbing cuts thoroughly with salt and packing them in more salt. Properly done, this would draw out moisture and create an environment where harmful bacteria couldn't grow. After a few weeks, the meat would be rinsed and could be cooked as needed throughout winter. Smoking was another effective method, hanging meat in the rafters where the constant smoke from the hearth would slowly cure it. By midday, the village was alive with activity. The smells of blood and smoke hung in the air as families processed animals for winter storage. Nothing would be wasted. Blood became puddings, intestines became sausage casings, fat was rendered for cooking and lighting. Bones would flavour soups and stews. The community aspect of medieval life became most apparent in these crucial moments. Families helped each other with labor-intensive tasks, sharing tools and expertise. The village's two elderly sisters, both widows, couldn't manage slaughtering on their own, so neighbors included their one pig in the day's work. In return, the sisters would spin wool through the winter months for those who helped them. As the short November day began to wane, Thomas returned home with their family's share of fresh meat. His clothes were blood-spattered, his hands raw from the cold work, but there was satisfaction in his face. The slaughtering had gone well. "We'll have enough," he told Emma quietly, so the children wouldn't hear the note of relief in his voice. Some years, the question of having enough food to last the winter hung like a shadow over every family. This year, the harvest had been adequate, if not abundant. That evening, as darkness fell by mid-afternoon, the family gathered around the central hearth. They enjoyed a rare feast of fresh meat, the parts that couldn't be preserved and had to be eaten immediately. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls as William carefully split small pieces of kindling for the morning fire. "Tell us about the worst winter, Father," their youngest daughter Agnes asked, her eyes wide in the firelight. Thomas exchanged a glance with Emma. They both remembered the winter of 1315, when they were children. The rains had come early and stayed late, ruining crops across Europe. What followed was famine on a scale that decimated villages. Some said a quarter of the population died before spring brought relief. "Better to tell of the winter your grandmother faced as a girl," Emma interjected, not wanting to frighten the children with tales of the Great Famine, when the Thames froze so solid they held a fair on the ice. Thomas nodded gratefully and began to describe the winter of 1309. When for weeks the mighty river turned to solid ice. Merchants set up stalls on the frozen surface, roasted meats over fires built right on the ice, and people even rode horses from one bank to the other. The frost fairs were a rare bright spot in the otherwise grim reality of medieval winters. For most ordinary people, winter was a time of confinement, monotony, and ever-present danger. Yet humans are remarkably adaptable, and medieval communities developed intricate systems to survive the cold months. As the family listened to Thomas's stories, the wind picked up outside. Through the cracks in the door, they could see snowflakes beginning to swirl in the darkness. The first real snow of the season had arrived. "Time to bank the fire for the night," Thomas said, carefully arranging the logs to keep embers alive until morning. Starting a fire from scratch was difficult and time-consuming. Maintaining one was much easier. The family prepared for bed much as they had every night as the weather turned colder. Agnes placed hot stones, warmed by the fire and wrapped in rags, at the foot of the bedding. Extra clothing was layered over their sleeping garments. The shutters were checked to ensure they were secure against the wind. Thomas was the last to bed, taking a final look around their small home. The meat hung from the rafters, the carefully stored vegetables were safe in their cool, dry corner, and the woodpile was stacked nearly to the ceiling on one side of the room. They were as ready as they could be. As he settled beside Emma, pulling the rough woolen blankets and fur coverlet up to his chin, he listened to the wind howling outside. Winter had arrived in earnest, earlier than usual. The real test of survival was just beginning. Outside, the snow fell faster, blanketing the village in white. Medieval winters were a time of extremes, of biting cold and cozy hearths, of community cooperation and isolated hardship, of potential starvation and careful preparation. For Thomas Fletcher and his family, the next few months would test every skill, every resource, and every bit of resilience they possessed. The night deepened, and the fire burned low. In homes across the village, families huddled together for warmth, their breath visible in the cold air despite the fires. As they drifted into sleep, no one knew exactly what challenges this winter would bring. but they had prepared as best they could, guided by generations of wisdom passed down through the hard-learned lessons of survival. In the darkness of a medieval winter night, that would have to be enough. The snow continued to fall through the night, piling against the sides of the Fletcher home. By morning, the world outside had transformed into a landscape of white and grey. Thomas woke before dawn, as he always did, and immediately felt the sharp bite of cold against his face. The fire had burned down to faint embers during the night. Moving quietly to avoid waking the others, he slipped from beneath the covers and padded across the packed earth floor. The chill seeped through his woolen socks, a reminder of the season's dangers. Carefully, he knelt by the hearth and began the daily ritual of reviving the fire. This was perhaps the most crucial skill of winter survival, maintaining fire. Thomas added a handful of dry straw to the embers and gently blew on them. The straw caught, and he gradually added small twigs, then larger pieces of kindling. Within minutes, a small flame danced in the hearth. Only then did he add a proper log, positioning it carefully to maximize the heat it would provide. The Fletcher home, like most peasant dwellings of medieval England, was built with winter in mind. Though simple by our standards, these structures incorporated generations of wisdom about surviving the cold. The single-room cottage measured roughly 20 feet by 15 feet. Small enough to be heated by a single fire, but large enough to house the family and some of their animals during the coldest months. Emma stirred as the fire's light grew stronger. "Is it snowing still?" she asked, her voice hushed to avoid waking the children. Thomas nodded, peering through a crack in the shutters. "Nearly up to my knees, I'd say. Wind's driving it against the south wall." This was actually good news. Snow was an excellent insulator, and a good snowfall piled against the house walls helped keep the precious heat inside. In the harshest winters, some villagers even piled snow manually against their walls for this very purpose. The walls themselves were constructed of wattle and daub, a framework of woven sticks, wattle, covered with a mixture of clay, straw, and sometimes animal dung, daub. This created a surprisingly effective insulation. The straw trapped air pockets, while the clay provided thermal mass that absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night. As the fire grew stronger, the central room began to warm. Though warm was a relative term in medieval winter, the Fletchers would consider the room comfortable at what we might find chilly, perhaps 50-55 degrees Fahrenheit at best, and often much cooler. William and Margaret woke next, both immediately moving closer to the growing fire. The youngest, Agnes, remained curled under the blankets. "We should check the roof," Thomas said to William. "That much snow could be heavy." The thatched roof was both an advantage and a liability in winter. The thick layers of straw provided excellent insulation against both cold and heat, but heavy snow could damage it if allowed to accumulate. Most medieval houses had steeply pitched roofs specifically to shed snow, but particularly heavy falls still required attention. While the men prepared to clear the roof, Emma and Margaret began the morning meal. Breakfast in winter was simple but hearty. Porridge made from oats or barley, perhaps flavoured with a bit of honey if they were fortunate. Unlike us, medieval people didn't have separate meals of breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Instead, they typically ate 2 meals, a lighter one in the morning and the main meal in the afternoon. "Put on your leg wrappings before you go outside," Emma instructed William, pointing to the long strips of woolen cloth piled near the door. Medieval winter clothing was all about layers, with wool being the most crucial material. Unlike cotton, which loses its insulating properties when wet, wool continues to provide warmth even in damp conditions, essential in the often wet winters of northern Europe. For ordinary working people, winter clothing was practical rather than fashionable. Men wore woolen tunics reaching to the knee or mid-thigh, with undergarments of linen. In winter, they would add additional tunics or a heavier woolen overtunic. Legs were covered with loose-fitting trousers or hose, often with additional woolen leg wrappings wound around from ankle to knee. Women wore long woolen gowns with linen undergarments, adding extra layers as needed. Both sexes wore caps or hoods to retain body heat, as much of it escapes through the head. Mittens rather than gloves were common. The fingers sharing warmth was more effective than each finger being isolated. Footwear was a challenge. Leather shoes offered little insulation, so thick woolen socks were essential. Some people added insoles of felt or straw for additional warmth. In deep snow, wooden pattens, a type of overshoe, helped keep feet above the wet ground. Be careful on the roof, Emma cautioned as Thomas and William prepared to climb the rough ladder to the thatch. The storm's not finished yet. Indeed, snow still fell, though less heavily than during the night. The temperature had risen slightly with the daylight, but remained well below freezing. The village was eerily quiet, most people choosing to remain indoors unless absolutely necessary. From the roof, Thomas and William could see the entire village blanketed in white. Smoke rose from each house, creating grey columns against the pale sky. Near the manor house, which stood apart from the peasant dwellings, servants were already clearing paths. The manor house represented a different approach to winter survival. Built of stone rather than wattle and daub, it was both more durable and, ironically, often colder. Stone conducted heat away quickly, making such buildings difficult to warm. However, the Lord's house had advantages unavailable to peasants. Multiple fireplaces rather than a central hearth, glazed windows that admitted light while blocking wind, and tapestries hung on walls to add insulation. For the Lord's family, winter comfort came through luxury adaptations, finer furs, better fuel for hotter fires, and servants to maintain them constantly. Yet even the nobility felt winter's bite. Castle life in January could be miserable, with draughty halls and bedchambers so cold that ice sometimes formed in water basins overnight. The Fletchers, like most peasants, had adapted their living space for maximum winter efficiency. The house was oriented with the smaller end facing the prevailing winter winds, minimizing the surface exposed to the elements. The door was on the lee side, protected from direct wind. Inside, the central hearth was positioned to heat the entire space as evenly as possible. By mid-morning, the immediate chores were complete. The roof was cleared, more firewood was brought in from the covered stack outside, and breakfast was finished. Now came the challenge that defined winter days: how to stay warm while conserving precious fuel. "Agnes, bring your spinning to the fire," Emma instructed her youngest. "Margaret, we'll work on the weaving." Winter was the season of indoor work, particularly textiles. While men might brave the cold for essential tasks like caring for livestock or repairing tools, women and children often spent the short days spinning, weaving, and sewing. These tasks could be done in the dim light of winter and close to the hearth. "The cow needs milking," Thomas reminded William. Though they had slaughtered some animals before winter, the family kept one milk cow in the byre, the attached shelter that housed livestock. During particularly cold spells, the cow might even be brought into the main room of the house. This practice of sharing living space with animals wasn't simply due to affection for livestock. Animals generated considerable body heat, and having them indoors was a practical way to stay warmer. A cow could raise the ambient temperature of a small house by several degrees. The chickens in their corner coop added their modest heat as well. "The snow's good for something at least," William observed as he returned with a small pail of milk. "The byre feels warmer with the drifts against it." Thomas nodded. "Check for any gaps where the wind gets in. Pack them with straw if you find any. Drafts were the enemy of winter warmth. Medieval homes lacked window glass, instead using shutters, oiled parchment, or thin animal skins to cover openings. These were imperfect barriers, and cold air inevitably found its way inside. Vigilance in sealing gaps was a constant winter chore. As noon approached, Emma added ingredients to the pot hanging over the fire. Winter meals centered around what had been preserved: dried beans, salted meat, stored root vegetables. Today's pottage contained a bit of salted pork for flavor, dried peas, onions, and turnips from the storage pit. The storage pit was another medieval winter adaptation, a small cellar or hole dug into the ground and lined with straw, where root vegetables could be kept cool but not frozen. Some vegetables, like cabbages, might be preserved by pickling or fermentation instead. While the pottage simmered, filling the house with its savoury aroma, Thomas worked on repairing a wooden harrow by the light of the fire. Tools had to be ready for spring planting, which would come sooner than it seemed during these dark days. "The wind's picking up again," Margaret noted, pausing in her weaving to listen to the howl around the eaves. Thomas glanced at the fire. They were using wood faster than he'd like on such a cold day, but there was no help for it. Without adequate heat, they risked not just discomfort, but danger. Every winter, the village lost at least one elderly person to the cold. "We'll move the bedding closer to the hearth tonight," he decided. On the coldest nights, the family would abandon their usual sleeping arrangements and create pallets directly around the fire, taking turns adding fuel throughout the night. By early afternoon, the main meal was ready. The family gathered around the fire to eat from wooden bowls, savouring the warmth of the food as much as its flavour. Mealtimes were a bright spot in winter days, a pause in the constant effort to stay warm. "Tell us more about the frost fair, Father," Agnes requested between spoonfuls of pottage. Thomas smiled, always ready to share stories that made winter seem magical rather than merely threatening. "Well, they say that in the Great Frost of 1309, the Thames froze so hard that people walked across it as easily as a road. Merchants set up booths on the ice itself, selling hot wines and roasted meats. There were games and races, musicians and jugglers." What Thomas didn't mention was that such extreme freezes also brought extreme hardship. During frost fairs, many died from cold, hunger, or accidents on the ice, but stories of winter's wonders helped balance the reality of its dangers. After the meal, the family returned to their tasks, staying close to the fire as daylight began to fade. All too early in December, winter days were brutally short, with darkness falling by mid-afternoon. This limited productive time and extended the dangerous cold of night. "We should check on Widow Thatcher," Emma said as she put aside her weaving. "She was coughing badly at the slaughtering yesterday." Community was crucial to winter survival. Neighbours checked on one another, particularly the elderly or those living alone. A simple cold could become deadly during winter, and someone unable to maintain their fire might freeze without intervention. While Emma wrapped herself in an extra layer to visit the neighbouring cottage, Thomas prepared the house for evening. He moved the livestock feed closer to the door to minimise trips outside. He checked their water barrel, now containing melted snow rather than well water, as the path to the village well was treacherous with ice. The house had no candles to spare. These expensive items were saved for emergencies or special occasions. Instead, a simple rushlight provided illumination after dark. This primitive lamp was made by soaking a reed in animal fat and then lighting it. It gave poor light by modern standards, but was sufficient for the limited activities of winter evenings. As darkness fell fully, Emma returned from her neighbourly visit. "She's better today," she reported. "Her grandson has come to stay with her until the snow melts." The family gathered close to the fire for the evening hours. This was a time for talking, for sharing knowledge, for strengthening bonds that helped them survive. Thomas taught William how to carve a new handle for a tool, their heads bent together over the work. Emma showed the girls a new stitch for darning worn socks. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind continued to blow, driving new snow against the house. But inside, the Fletcher family had created a pocket of warmth and life amid winter's harshness. This was the rhythm of medieval winter, a constant balance between conservation and necessity, between the danger of the elements and the warmth of human ingenuity and community. Their house, humble as it was, represented centuries of adaptation to the season's challenges. As they prepared for bed, banking the fire carefully to preserve embers for morning, Thomas glanced around the single room that was their entire world during winter. It wasn't much by any standard, yet it stood between them and the killing cold outside. Their ancestors had learned through bitter trial and error how to create these shelters, how to insulate them, how to maximize the precious heat of fire. The snow continued to fall through the darkness, piling deeper against the walls. Within their simple home, the Fletcher family slept, warmed by fire, by wool, by shared body heat, and by the accumulated wisdom of generations who had faced and survived the medieval winter before them. The next morning dawned clear and brutally cold. The snow had stopped during the night, leaving behind a crystalline landscape that sparkled in the weak winter sun. Thomas woke to find frost patterns on the inside of the shutters, a sign of just how cold it had become. As he revived the fire, coaxing warmth from the overnight embers, his mind turned to their food stores. The heavy snow meant hunting would be difficult, and they'd be relying entirely on what they'd preserved. He mentally calculated how long their supplies might last, if the winter proved especially harsh. Food was the foundation of winter survival. In the feast or famine cycle of medieval life, winter represented the greatest challenge to staying nourished. The strategies developed to preserve and extend food supplies were ingenious, born of necessity and refined over generations. "We should inventory what we have," Thomas suggested to Emma as she joined him by the fire. "The snow's deeper than I expected this early in the season." She nodded, understanding his concern. "I'll check the storage pit after breakfast." The family's winter food was distributed across several storage locations, each suited to preserving different types of provisions. The most important was the storage pit, a small cellar-like space dug into the ground either inside the house or just outside it. Lined with straw for insulation, the pit maintained a temperature just above freezing, ideal for preserving root vegetables. After a simple breakfast of barley porridge, Emma bundled up and went to check the outdoor storage pit. Located just behind their cottage, it was covered with a wooden lid now buried under snow. She brushed away the snow and lifted the lid, revealing the dark space below. Inside, carefully arranged, were their precious root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, carrots and beets layered with straw to prevent freezing and rotting. Also stored here were cabbages, their outer leaves intentionally left on as protection against the cold. Emma inspected them carefully, removing any that showed signs of spoilage. "The turnips and parsnips look good," she reported when she returned. "We have enough to last until February, I think. The carrots are fewer than last year." Thomas nodded. Root vegetables formed the backbone of winter nutrition for medieval people, rich in carbohydrates and able to be stored for months without special treatment. They were the safest bet for winter sustenance. "What about the grain?" he asked. "2 sacks of barley, 1 of rye, and half a sack of wheat," Emma replied, "plus the dried peas and beans." Grains were the most precious winter food. Stored in large sacks or barrels, they had to be kept dry and protected from vermin. The Fletcher family, like most peasants, had a grain chest, a sturdy wooden box raised off the ground on legs to deter mice and rats. Inside, their winter grain supply was carefully rationed. Medieval people didn't think in terms of calories or nutrition as we do, but they understood that different foods provided different kinds of sustenance. Grains delivered the feeling of fullness and energy needed for winter work. A person needed about 2 pounds of grain per day to survive, though in winter, with reduced activity, they might manage on less. The salt meat, Thomas continued, mentally cataloguing their resources. 4 hams smoking in the rafters, the salted beef in the barrel, and sausages drying, Emma said, plus the smoked fish we traded for. Meat was a luxury, but crucial in winter when fresh vegetables were unavailable. The preservation of meat had begun immediately after slaughter at Martinmas. Some cuts were heavily salted and packed in barrels, while others were smoked or dried. Properly preserved meat could last months or even years. The smoking technique was straightforward but effective. Meat was hung high in the rafters where the smoke from the daily fire would slowly cure it. The smoke contained compounds that preserved the meat while also imparting flavour. The higher and cooler area of the cottage, away from the direct heat of the fire, was perfect for this process. "And we have 3 wheels of cheese," Margaret added, "plus the honey pot and dried fruits." Dairy products were transformed for winter storage. Fresh milk couldn't be preserved, but cheese could last for months or even years. The Fletchers had made several wheels of hard cheese during the summer and fall when their cow produced the most milk. Now, these aged wheels provided precious fat and protein during the lean months. Thomas nodded, satisfied with the inventory. They had enough to survive a normal winter, though there was little margin for excess. The real challenge would come in late winter and early spring, the time known as the hunger gap, when stored foods began to run low but new crops weren't yet available. "We'll need to be careful with the grain," he said, "especially if this cold holds." Medieval food preservation was a complex science developed through trial and error over centuries. Without refrigeration, people relied on methods that changed the environment around the food to prevent spoilage: drying, smoking, salting, fermenting, pickling, and sugaring. Each method had advantages and limitations. Drying removed moisture that bacteria needed to grow, making it perfect for fruits, herbs, and some vegetables. Smoking added compounds that prevented bacterial growth while drying the food. Salting drew out moisture through osmosis and created an environment hostile to microbes. Fermentation encouraged beneficial bacteria that prevented harmful ones from developing. Pickling in vinegar created high acidity that preserved vegetables. Sugaring, coating fruits in honey, sealed them from the air and prevented spoilage. As Emma prepared the midday meal, these preservation methods were evident in every ingredient she used. The pottage today contained dried peas, salt pork, and turnips from the storage pit. She seasoned it with dried herbs from bundles hanging from the rafters, thyme, sage, and a precious pinch of imported pepper they'd received as payment for a woodworking job Thomas had done for the miller. "The bread's almost gone," Agnes observed as Emma cut thin slices from their loaf to accompany the meal. "We'll bake tomorrow," Emma replied. "The flour's already mixed." Bread was a staple, but baking required significant fuel. Most peasant families didn't bake daily as we might imagine. Instead, they created dense, hearty loaves that would last several days or even weeks. Some communities shared a communal oven to conserve fuel, but in harsh winter weather, each family typically baked in their own hearth. The actual bread of medieval winters was quite different from our modern idea of bread. Made primarily from barley or rye rather than wheat, it was dark, dense, and often sour. Wheat was reserved for special occasions or for selling to wealthier households. The coarser grains produced a heartier loaf that stayed edible longer, a crucial feature for winter storage. As they ate their midday meal, Thomas shared plans for the afternoon. If the weather holds, William and I will check the rabbit snares. We might have fresh meat for tomorrow. Hunting provided an important supplement to stored foods, though winter made it challenging. Heavy snow limited mobility and game was scarcer and leaner. Still, rabbits, squirrels, and winter birds could be trapped or hunted, providing fresh meat to vary the monotonous winter diet. "Mind you stay on our common lands," Emma cautioned. "The Lord's Forester was asking about poaching just last week. The distinction was important. Peasants had rights to hunt small game on common land, but the forests belonged to the Lord, and hunting there, especially for larger animals like deer, was strictly forbidden. The penalties for poaching could be severe, from fines to mutilation or even death in extreme cases." After the meal, Thomas and William prepared to check their traps. They wrapped extra cloths around their feet and legs for warmth and pulled woolen caps down over their ears. "We won't be long," Thomas promised. "If the weather turns, we'll come straight back." While they were gone, Emma and the girls continued indoor work. Food preparation in winter was a constant activity. Without modern conveniences, every meal required significant time and effort. The girls helped their mother grind grain for tomorrow's bread, turning the small hand quern, a simple stone mill, to produce coarse flour. "Why can't we use the miller's mill?" Agnes asked, her arms already tired from the effort. "The path's too dangerous with ice," Margaret answered before her mother could, "and besides, the miller takes a portion as payment. Indeed, the village mill, powered by water or wind, produced finer flour more efficiently than hand querns, but the miller charged for this service, typically about 1/16 of the grain brought for milling. In winter, when every handful of grain was precious, many families chose to grind their own, accepting the coarser texture to preserve their supply." The afternoon wore on, the weak winter sun already beginning to sink, though it was barely past midday. Emma stirred the pottage occasionally and set out ingredients for the next day's baking. From the rafters, she cut a small piece of salt pork to add flavour to tomorrow's meals. The preservation of meat required careful management. Once a piece was cut into, it needed to be used relatively quickly. The outer portions, more thoroughly dried or salted, were saved for later in the winter. This careful rationing ensured that preserved meats would last through the lean months. Thomas and William returned as dusk approached, bringing welcome news. 2 rabbits caught in their snares. This fresh meat would provide a change from the preserved foods they'd been eating and add valuable protein to their diet. "The snow's good for tracking," William reported excitedly. "I saw deer prints near the stream, though they were heading toward the Lord's forest." Thomas nodded but said nothing. In the harshest winters, when food ran dangerously low, some villagers risked poaching from the Lord's lands. It was a desperate measure, taken only when starvation threatened. For now, their stored provisions were sufficient. The rabbits were quickly skinned, the valuable fur set aside for later use. Nothing would be wasted. The meat would be cooked, the organs added to pottage, the bones saved for soup. Even the blood was collected to make a simple pudding. "We'll have rabbit stew tomorrow," Emma decided, hanging the cleaned carcasses from a hook near the hearth. The cool corner of the house would keep the meat fresh for a day or two. As evening settled in, the family gathered for their second meal of the day. Winter typically meant 2 meals rather than 3. The shorter days and reduced activity made this pattern practical, and it conserved food supplies. The evening meal was similar to the midday one. More pottage, though slightly thicker as it had cooked down through the day with the last of the bread. "The ale's running low," Thomas noted as he drained his wooden cup. "I've grain set aside for brewing," Emma assured him. "We can start a new batch tomorrow if the weather's not too cold." Ale was more than just a beverage in medieval winter. It was a significant source of calories and nutrition. Made from fermented grain, it provided carbohydrates and, importantly, was safer to drink than potentially contaminated water. Even children drank weak ale, though with lower alcohol content than that consumed by adults. The brewing process was another task that fell primarily to women. They would malt the grain, allowing it to sprout slightly, then dry it, crush it, and mix it with hot water to extract the sugars. Wild yeasts or remnants from previous batches would ferment the liquid, producing ale within a few days. After the evening meal, Thomas brought out a small jar of preserved berries, blackberries they'd gathered in late summer and preserved in honey. This rare sweet treat was rationed carefully, saved for occasions when spirits needed lifting or energy needed boosting. "Just a spoonful each," Emma said, serving the precious berries. "We need to make them last." The honey-preserved fruit was not just a treat, but a practical source of quick energy. The natural sugars provided an immediate boost, particularly valuable during the cold months when the body burned more calories simply staying warm. Honey itself was a valuable preservative and medicine used to treat coughs and minor wounds. As they enjoyed this small luxury, Thomas discussed plans for the coming days. "If the cold holds, we should slaughter one of the chickens," he suggested. "The old hen's not laying anymore, and she's eating grain we could use." Winter required such calculations, weighing the value of keeping animals alive against the resources they consumed. A chicken that wasn't producing eggs became a liability, consuming precious grain without providing return. Better to harvest the meat and save the feed for more productive animals. "We can make soup from the whole bird," Emma agreed, "with barley and the last of the onions." Soups and potages were the most efficient winter meals, extracting maximum nutrition from minimal ingredients. A single chicken could flavour several days' worth of pottage if used carefully. The carcass simmered repeatedly until every bit of flavour was extracted. As darkness deepened outside, the family prepared for bed. The day's food management, checking stores, preparing meals, planning usage had taken significant time and mental energy. In our modern world of abundance, it's difficult to imagine the constant calculations involved in medieval winter survival. Would the grain last until spring? Were the vegetables in the storage pit staying fresh or beginning to rot? Was the smoked meat curing properly? Should they use more salt now to preserve additional food, or save it for later in winter when fresh options disappeared entirely? These questions occupied much of the family's daily thoughts. The fire burned low as they settled in for the night. Outside, the temperature dropped further, stars glittering in the clear sky, a beautiful sight that promised dangerous cold. Inside, the Fletcher family slept, their bodies nourished by foods preserved through ancient methods, their survival dependent on the careful management of resources that had to last until spring brought renewal. Their relationship with food was intimate and urgent in a way modern people rarely experience. Each meal represented careful planning, each ingredient the result of preservation techniques refined over centuries of winter survival. In the quiet of the medieval night, as frost formed on the landscape outside, these stored foods were the difference between life and death. A week passed, each day following a similar pattern of survival. The Fletchers rose before dawn, rekindled the fire, tended to essential tasks, prepared and rationed food, and retired early as darkness claimed the short winter days. Outside, the snow remained deep, with frozen pathways beaten between houses by villagers' feet. On the 8th day after the first heavy snowfall, the church bell rang, calling the village to Sunday Mass. Despite the cold, attendance wasn't optional. Both religious obligation and community need drew people from their warm hearths to the stone church at the village centre. "Wear your best tunics," Emma instructed as the family prepared to leave, "and mind the ice on the path." Church was more than religious observance. It was the centre of medieval social life, especially in winter when fieldwork ceased. The stone building was perpetually cold, but the gathering of bodies provided warmth, and the shared experience offered comfort of a different kind. The Fletchers joined other families making their way through the snow. Everyone wore their finest clothes, though finest was relative, perhaps a tunic with minimal patches or a head covering with simple embroidery. Winter church attendance wasn't just about piety. It was a rare opportunity to see neighbours, exchange news, and maintain the community bonds essential for survival. Inside, the church was indeed cold, but candles flickered on the altar, and the familiar Latin words of the Mass created a sense of continuity and stability. Most villagers understood little of the Latin service, but they knew when to kneel, when to stand, and when to make the sign of the cross. Father Stephen, the village priest, looked gaunt as he conducted the service. Winter was difficult for him too. His small cottage beside the church had only a modest hearth, and as a single man he lacked the family support network that helped others survive the cold months. After Mass ended, villagers lingered, reluctant to return immediately to their isolated homes. This was the true purpose of Sunday gathering in winter, the chance to connect, to share information, to reaffirm community. "Any word from the manor about work?" Thomas asked John Cooper, who sometimes served as a messenger between the village and the Lord's estate. "Nothing yet," John replied, "though they're saying the Lord will need men to clear fallen trees once the snow melts." Such information was valuable. Winter work was scarce but essential for families whose food stores might not last until spring. Clearing fallen timber, repairing roads, or helping with construction at the manor provided rare opportunities to earn food or coin during the lean months. The women gathered in their own circles, exchanging different but equally vital information. "My youngest has a cough that won't quit," said Alice Miller, her face lined with worry. "Nothing seems to help." "Try honey and ground pine needles steeped in hot water," Emma suggested. "It helped Agnes last winter. Medical knowledge was passed this way, from woman to woman, tested through generations of trial and error. With no doctors available to peasants, these folk remedies represented the best hope for treating winter ailments." Children played in the churchyard despite the cold, throwing snowballs and sliding on the ice. These moments of freedom from the confines of small, smoky houses were precious, allowing pent-up energy to be released. As the gathering broke up, Father Stephen approached Thomas. "Will you and William join us tonight?" he asked. "I've been teaching young Henry to play chess, and we could use more players." Thomas nodded, pleased at the invitation. "We'll come after the evening meal," he promised. This was another aspect of winter community, small gatherings in different homes or at the church, providing entertainment and companionship during the long, dark evenings. Back at their cottage, Emma prepared the midday meal while Thomas added precious fuel to the fire. The church visit had chilled them, and they needed to restore warmth to both their bodies and their home. "Can we go to Widow Thatcher's tonight for stories?" Agnes asked as they ate. "She promised to tell about the fairy rings last week." "If the weather holds," Emma agreed, "and if you finish your spinning first." Evening gatherings served multiple purposes in medieval winter. They allowed several families to share a single fire, conserving precious fuel. They provided entertainment when no other diversions were available. Most importantly, they maintained the social fabric of the village, strengthening bonds that might be called upon in times of need. As promised, Thomas and William headed to the priest's cottage after their evening meal. Wrapped in extra layers against the bitter night air, the snow squeaked beneath their feet, a sign of extreme cold. Above, the stars glittered in a clear sky, beautiful but foreboding. Clear winter nights were always the coldest. Father Stephen's cottage was modest, but contained luxuries unavailable to most villagers. A few precious books, a real glass window, though tiny, and a chess set carved from wood. The pieces were simple but recognizable, worn smooth from years of handling. "Welcome, welcome!" The priest greeted them, ushering them toward the fire. "Henry's already here, eager to show his new skills." Henry, the blacksmith's son, was 16 and uncommonly bright. The priest had taken an interest in him, teaching him to read simple Latin and to play chess, a game usually reserved for nobles and clergy. The chessboard was set up on a small table near the hearth. The rules they played by were somewhat different from modern chess, but the basic concepts were similar: strategy, foresight, and careful planning. These same skills helped communities survive winter, making the game both entertainment and practical education. "The bishop moves only on diagonals," Father Stephen reminded William, who played less frequently than the others. "Like this." The men and boys played for several hours, the competition friendly but intense. Chess was more than a game. It was an escape from the monotony of winter, a chance to exercise minds that might otherwise dwell too much on the cold and hunger. Meanwhile, Emma and the girls made their way to Widow Thatcher's cottage, joining several other women and children already gathered there. The widow's home was small but warm, with a well-maintained fire and walls recently replastered with fresh daub to keep out drafts. Come in, Chiara." The old woman greeted them. Despite her age and the recent illness, her eyes were bright with the anticipation of company. "We're just about to start." The cottage was crowded but cosy, with women sitting on benches, stools, and cushions made from straw-stuffed sacking. Most had brought some handwork, spinning, sewing, or mending that could be done while listening to stories. The practical never ceased, even during leisure time. "Tell us about the fairy rings," one of the younger children requested, echoing Agnes's earlier wish. The widow smiled, settling into her role as keeper of tales. "Well now, you all know the green circles that appear in the meadows in summer," she began. "They say those are where the fairies dance on Midsummer's Eve. But in winter, those same fairies go underground, and if you listen carefully on the stillest nights, you can hear their music beneath the snow." The children's eyes widened, imagining the magical world beneath the frozen landscape. The adults smiled too, not because they necessarily believed the tale, but because stories brought colour and wonder to the monochrome winter world. Storytelling was the primary entertainment of medieval winter evenings. With no books, television, or internet, the spoken word carried the community's history, values, and imagination. Stories connected listeners to a world beyond their immediate circumstances, a particularly valuable escape during winter confinement. "But you must never follow that music," the widow continued, her voice dropping dramatically. "For those who dance with the winter fairies are never seen again in the world of men." The story continued, weaving elements of old pagan beliefs with Christian morals, a common feature of medieval folklore. When it ended, another woman took up the role of storyteller, sharing a tale about a clever peasant who outwitted a greedy lord. This tale brought knowing smiles. Such stories of peasant triumph over authority were popular, but would never be told where the lord or his representatives might hear. The winter gathering was a safe space for such small rebellions of the imagination. As the evening progressed, the women shared not just stories but songs, work songs that normally accompanied summer labour in the fields, love ballads that had been passed down for generations, and religious hymns learned from church services. The music filled the small cottage, creating a warmth that went beyond the physical heat of the fire. Medieval songs were typically unaccompanied, sung in unison rather than harmony. The melodies were simple but memorable, designed to be easily learned and passed on through oral tradition. Like stories, they preserved community knowledge and values while providing entertainment during the long, dark evenings. In both the priest's cottage and the widow's home, the gatherings continued until the fires burned low. Then, reluctantly, the visitors prepared to return to their own homes. The short journey through the frigid night was the price paid for hours of companionship and entertainment. "Mind the path," Thomas cautioned William as they left the priest's cottage. "It's all ice now." The night had grown colder still, the stars brilliant in the black sky. Their breath formed clouds in the freezing air, and the snow crunched loudly underfoot. They walked quickly, eager to return to their own hearth. Emma and the girls were already home when they arrived, the cottage seeming especially dark and cold after the animated gatherings they'd all enjoyed. Thomas quickly revived the banked fire, adding fuel carefully measured to last until morning. "Did you win at chess?" Emma asked as they prepared for bed. "Father Stephen always wins," William replied with a good-natured shrug, "but I lasted longer this time." "And the widow's stories?" Thomas asked his daughters. Agnes launched into an enthusiastic retelling of the fairy ring tale, her eyes still wide with wonder. Margaret, at 14, pretended greater sophistication but listened intently to her sister's narration. This sharing of experiences was itself a form of entertainment, extending the pleasure of the evening gatherings. Each family member had different stories to tell, different songs they'd heard, different news they'd gathered. The next day brought another dimension of medieval winter entertainment. A travelling peddler arrived in the village, his pack laden with small goods from distant markets. Such visitors were rare in winter, when roads were often impassable, making his arrival a significant event. Word spread quickly, and villagers gathered in the open area near the church to see what he offered. The peddler, a short man with a weather-beaten face, displayed his wares on a piece of cloth spread over the snow. Ribbons, needles, simple jewellery, spices, and small tools. Few villagers had coin to spend, especially in winter when income opportunities were scarce, but the peddler accepted other forms of payment: eggs, cheese, small handicrafts that he could sell elsewhere. This barter system allowed even poor communities to access goods from beyond their immediate area. The peddler was valuable for more than just his wares. As he travelled between villages and towns, he gathered news and stories, becoming a human newspaper in a world without mass communication. "They say the river's frozen solid 10 miles north," he reported to the gathered villagers, "and food's growing scarce in the town. You're better off here with your own stores." Such information helped communities gauge their relative situations and prepare for challenges that might be heading their way. If famine or disease was reported in nearby areas, villages could limit travel or ration supplies more carefully. The peddler also brought songs and stories from other regions, introducing new elements to the local repertoire. That evening, the regular gatherings buzzed with fresh tales he'd shared, some believable, others clearly embellished, but all providing welcome novelty in the winter routine. 2 days later, the village experienced another form of winter entertainment, one with deeper religious significance. January 6th marked Epiphany, the celebration of the Magi's visit to the infant Jesus. This important church feast provided a break in the winter monotony and a chance for structured communal celebration. The day began with a special mass, the church decorated with evergreen boughs, symbols of life persisting through winter. After the service, the village held a modest feast in the churchyard. Each family contributed what they could: a loaf of bread, a small piece of cheese, some preserved fruit or meat. By modern standards, it was a humble meal, but in the context of winter scarcity, the shared feast represented abundance and generosity. Children received special treats, perhaps a bite of honey cake or a small sweetmeat saved specifically for this occasion. The Epiphany celebration included the selection of a bean king, a tradition in which a bean was hidden in a special cake, and whoever found it in their portion became king for the day. This year, the honour fell to 12-year-old Peter, the miller's son, who received a paper crown and the right to make playful royal commands to the other villagers. Such reversals of normal social order were common in medieval festivals, providing an outlet for tensions that built up in hierarchical societies. For one day, a child could playfully command adults, creating laughter and lightening the winter mood. The celebration included simple games, sack races on the packed snow, contests to see who could slide furthest on the ice, and blindfolded games where players tried to hit a suspended pot with a stick. The prizes were nominal, perhaps an extra portion of the feast or a small handicraft. But the real reward was the break from routine and the shared experience of play. As darkness fell, the celebration moved indoors to the larger homes in the village, where people continued to socialize until late in the evening. Candles were lit, a rare extravagance saved for special occasions, and music filled the winter night. For the Fletcher family, like all medieval households, these community entertainments provided essential balance to the hardships of winter. The shared stories, games, music, and celebrations created resilience, helping people endure cold, scarcity, and darkness by reminding them they were not alone in their struggles. As they walked home from the Epiphany feast, stars once again brilliant overhead, Thomas put his arm around Emma's shoulders. "A good day," he said simply. She nodded, understanding all he meant by those few words. In the harsh reality of medieval winter, a good day was one where hunger was temporarily forgotten, where laughter outweighed worry, and where community bonds were strengthened against the challenges still to come. The winter was far from over. The hardest months, February and March, still lay ahead, when food stores would run lowest and patience would wear thinnest. But the social fabric of the village, reinforced through shared entertainment and celebration, would help carry them through to spring. January gave way to February, bringing the deepest challenges of the medieval winter. In modern times, we think of February as the tail end of the cold season, but for Thomas Fletcher and his family, it marked the beginning of what many called the starving time, when food stores dwindled but spring's bounty remained a distant promise. The morning of Candlemas, February the 2nd, dawned grey and forbidding. Thomas woke with a heaviness in his chest that had nothing to do with the weather. As he kindled the day's fire from carefully preserved embers, he calculated their remaining supplies once more. "The grain is low," he told Emma quietly when she joined him. "We have perhaps 3 weeks of full rations. Then we must stretch it." She nodded, unsurprised. This was the rhythm of medieval winter: abundance at its beginning, careful management in its middle, and potential scarcity at its end. The period from February until the first spring harvests in May or June was historically the most dangerous time of year. "The dried peas will help," she said. "And we still have 2 wheels of cheese." Thomas appreciated her practical response. There was no point in dwelling on what couldn't be changed. The food they had preserved in autumn was what they had. No more could be acquired until spring brought new growth. As if to emphasize the challenges ahead, 6-year-old Agnes woke coughing, her small face flushed with fever. "Not again," Emma murmured, going to feel her daughter's forehead. The little girl had suffered from winter coughs for as long as she'd been alive, each cold season bringing at least one bout of respiratory illness. Medieval people didn't understand germs or viruses, but they recognized patterns. Winter confinement, multiple people living in close quarters, breathing smoky air with limited ventilation, inevitably led to illness. Children and the elderly were most vulnerable, and every winter claimed lives from pneumonia, influenza, and other respiratory diseases. Emma immediately began treatment based on generations of folk medicine. She steeped pine needles in hot water to create a tea rich in vitamin C, though she wouldn't have understood the chemistry. She mixed honey with herbs to soothe Agnes's throat and suppress her cough. Most importantly, she kept the child warm and encouraged her to drink frequently. "Should we call for Father Stephen?" Thomas asked, concern evident in his voice. The priest served as the closest thing to a doctor available to peasant families. Emma considered, placing her hand on Agnes's chest to feel her breathing. "Not yet," she decided. "The fever isn't too high and her breathing isn't laboured." This assessment, watching carefully for the difference between a common winter illness and a life-threatening one, was a crucial skill for medieval parents. Without modern medicine, they relied on observation, experience, and inherited knowledge to determine when an illness required intervention beyond home remedies. The family adjusted their routine to accommodate Agnes's care. Margaret took over more of the household tasks, while William assumed additional responsibilities outside. Thomas checked their store of dried herbs, making sure they had enough of the plants traditionally used to treat winter coughs. Medieval medicine combined practical remedies that often had real medicinal properties with religious and superstitious elements. Emma might brew a tea using herbs with genuine medicinal effects while also placing a blessed candle near Agnes's bed. Thomas might apply a poultice of effective medicinal plants while saying prayers for healing. In their world, the physical and spiritual aspects of healing were inseparable. By the next day, Agnes's fever had broken, though her cough persisted. Emma continued treatments, adding a cough syrup made from honey, herbs, and a small amount of their precious store of ale. The alcohol helped extract beneficial compounds from the herbs, while also having mild sedative properties that helped the child rest. While Agnes recovered, the rest of the family faced the ongoing challenges of late winter. The woodpile had diminished significantly, requiring Thomas and William to venture into the forest for more fuel. This task was more difficult than it had been in autumn. Snow made travel arduous, and the most accessible deadwood had already been collected. "We'll try near the old oak," Thomas decided, as they set out with hand sleds to haul whatever wood they found. There were some fallen branches there that were too green earlier in the season. They might be dry enough now. Firewood quality declined as winter progressed. The best, driest wood was used first, leaving greener or partially rotted pieces for late winter. These burned less efficiently and produced more smoke, adding to the discomfort of indoor confinement. Food supplies followed a similar pattern of declining quality. The best preserved meats and vegetables were often consumed earlier in the season, with less appetizing options saved for the lean months. The family's meals grew simpler and more monotonous. Porridge made thinner to stretch the grain, soups with fewer chunks of meat, bread that contained increasing proportions of ground peas or beans mixed with the diminishing flour. "We should check the beehives," Emma suggested one afternoon in mid-February. "If any colonies survived, they might have honey we could use." Beekeeping was an important aspect of medieval agriculture, providing both honey for sweetening and preservation and beeswax for candles. Most hives remained dormant through winter, with bees clustering inside for warmth. A healthy hive might contain surplus honey that could be carefully harvested even in winter, though beekeepers left enough for the colony to survive until spring flowers bloomed. Thomas and William trudged through the snow to check the family's two hives, located at the edge of their garden plot. One showed no signs of life. The colony had likely succumbed to cold or disease, but from the second came a faint buzzing when Thomas gently tapped its side. "They're alive in this one," he reported. "We'll leave them be for now. If we're desperate before spring, we can take a small amount of honey, but I'd rather let them keep their stores if possible." This restraint was characteristic of sustainable medieval farming practices. Taking too much honey might mean the death of the colony, eliminating not just future honey production, but also the crucial pollination bees provided for fruit trees and other crops. Long-term thinking often overrode immediate needs. As February continued, other challenges emerged. The stored root vegetables began to sprout in their dark storage pit, rapidly losing nutritional value. The last wheel of cheese developed a mouldy spot that had to be carefully cut away. The smoked meat hanging from the rafters had been used more quickly than planned due to Agnes's illness and the need for strengthening broths. The Fletcher family was not alone in these late winter struggles. Throughout the village, similar calculations and compromises were being made in every household. This was why medieval communities were so tightly knit. Individual families might face disaster alone, but collective resources and knowledge improved everyone's chances of survival. Evidence of this community approach came one evening when there was a knock at the Fletchers' door. Outside stood John Cooper holding a small package wrapped in cloth. "My wife sent this for Agnes," he said, handing the bundle to Thomas. "It's dried elderberries and the last of our honey. She says to make a syrup for the cough." Thomas accepted the gift with genuine gratitude. Later in winter, such generosity was especially meaningful. The Coopers were giving away food they might need themselves before spring, but this was the unwritten contract of village life. Help given would be help returned when circumstances changed. The gift illustrated another aspect of medieval winter survival, the exchange of specialized knowledge and resources. Different families excelled at different skills or had success with different crops and preservation methods. The Coopers were known for their herb garden and honey, while the Fletchers might share their expertise in wood carving or cheese making with neighbours in need. By late February, signs of coming change began to appear despite the persistent cold. The days grew noticeably longer, with darkness falling later each evening. This natural change had practical benefits. Extended daylight meant less fuel used for rushlights and more productive hours for indoor work. "Listen," William said one morning in early March, "birds." Indeed, the first migratory birds had returned, their songs a promise of spring, even as snow still covered the ground. Medieval people were acutely attuned to these natural indicators of seasonal change. They marked time not by calendars, but by observing the world around them. A bird migrations, bud formation on trees, changes in weather patterns. "We should check for willow catkins," Thomas suggested. "If they're emerging, we can make willow tea for Agnes's cough." Certain plants, like willow, produced their first growth while winter still held sway. These early signs of life weren't just symbols of hope, but practical resources. Willow contains salicin, a compound similar to aspirin, making it an effective treatment for pain and inflammation. Another example of how medieval folk medicine often had valid scientific foundations. As March progressed, the challenges of winter continued, but with an important psychological difference: the visible promise of eventual relief. Snowdrops pushed through the melting snow in protected areas. Ice began to break up on the village pond. The quality of light changed, becoming brighter and warmer even on cold days. These signs allowed the family to begin planning for spring activities. Thomas inspected and repaired farm tools that would soon be needed for ploughing and planting. Emma sorted through saved seeds, identifying what they had for the new growing season. William prepared fishing lines and hooks for when the streams became accessible again. "We should expand the garden this year," Thomas said during an evening meal of thin barley soup. "Plant more beans and peas. They kept well and filled our bellies this winter." This kind of reflection and planning was a crucial benefit of the winter season. Despite its hardships, winter provided time for medieval families to evaluate what had worked well and what needed improvement. Without the constant pressure of fieldwork, they could develop strategies for the coming year based on their recent experiences. The transitional period between winter and spring, roughly from mid-March through April, brought its own unique challenges. The weather became highly unpredictable, with warm, spring-like days followed by brutal cold snaps. Melting snow created mud that made travel difficult and increased the risk of flooding in low-lying areas. Food supplies reached their lowest point during this transition. The Fletchers, like most families, had exhausted most of their stored provisions, but couldn't yet harvest new crops. This was the true hunger gap, the dangerous weeks when medieval communities were most vulnerable to starvation. "We'll thin the porridge more," Emma decided, as she assessed their remaining grain in late March, "and send William to check the early fishing spots. The ice might be breaking up enough for him to catch something." Strategies for surviving this final phase of winter included reducing portions, extending meals with foraged plants as they became available, and pursuing fresh food sources like fish as soon as seasonal conditions allowed. Hunting improved as animals emerged from winter hibernation or returned from migration, though game remained lean after the scarce winter months. The village as a whole turned to communal approaches during this challenging time. Families with surplus shared with those in need, with the understanding that roles might be reversed in future years. The church distributed alms to the poorest households. Labour was exchanged for food. A strong young man might chop wood for an elderly neighbour in exchange for a portion of their remaining preserves. By early April, the first wild greens appeared. dandelions, nettles, and other plants dismissed as weeds in modern times but valued as vital nutrition in the medieval spring. These early plants were rich in vitamins and minerals depleted during winter's limited diet. Emma taught the girls which plants to gather and how to prepare them to remove bitterness while preserving nutrients. Nettles make the best spring soup, she explained as they carefully harvested the stinging plants using cloth-wrapped hands. They restore strength after winter weakness. Medieval people didn't understand vitamins or minerals as we do, but they observed the effects of different foods on health. Their traditional spring tonics and cleansing diets often contained exactly the nutrients needed to recover from winter's dietary restrictions. As April advanced, the pace of change accelerated. The last snow melted, except in deeply shaded areas. The soil warmed enough to begin preliminary garden work. Livestock that had been kept in close quarters all winter were gradually returned to pasture, though brought in at night when frost still threatened. For the Fletcher family, the official end of winter came with the spring planting. The exact timing varied by crop and local conditions, but typically began in late April or early May. The first planting of peas and beans marked the transition to the growing season and the gradual easing of food scarcity. "We made it," Thomas said simply on the evening after they planted the first seeds. There was no elaborate celebration. Medieval people didn't mark the end of winter with festivals as they did its beginning. Instead, there was quiet satisfaction in having survived another cycle of scarcity and cold. The lessons of winter survival were deeply embedded in medieval culture. Children absorbed knowledge through observation and participation, how to preserve food, conserve fuel, identify illness, and maintain community bonds during hardship. This practical education was as important as any formal schooling, preparing each generation for the cyclical challenges they would face. For Thomas and Emma, now in middle age by medieval standards, each winter survived represented both personal resilience and the successful transmission of knowledge to their children. William, at 14, had taken on increasingly important responsibilities throughout the winter. Margaret had mastered many of the household skills essential for a future as a wife and mother. Even young Agnes had begun learning the seasonal rhythms of survival. As April turned to May, winter became a memory rather than an immediate reality. The Fletcher home, so central to survival during the cold months, was now used primarily for sleeping and eating, with most activities taking place outdoors. Windows were unshuttered to admit fresh air and light. The central hearth was used mainly for cooking rather than constant heating. The family's focus shifted entirely to growth and abundance, planting crops, tending animals, and beginning the cycle of food production that would sustain them through the next winter. But the experiences of the cold months remained present in their planning and decision-making. Each farming choice was made with winter in mind, which crops stored best, which animals could be maintained through scarcity, how much fuel would be needed when cold returned. This constant awareness of winter, even in summer's abundance, was perhaps the most profound difference between medieval life and our modern experience. Today, we move between seasons with relatively little preparation, our basic needs met regardless of weather. For Thomas Fletcher and his family, the shadow of winter was always present, influencing every aspect of their lives throughout the year. As we lie in our temperature-controlled homes with groceries available year-round and medical care just a phone call away, it's worth reflecting on the ingenuity, resilience, and community cooperation that allowed our ancestors to survive the brutal reality of medieval winters. Their lives were harder than we can truly imagine, yet they found ways not just to endure, but to create meaning, preserve knowledge, and even find joy amid the greatest challenges. The medieval winter required physical strength, practical knowledge, careful planning, and social cooperation, qualities that remain valuable even in our technological age. As we drift towards sleep in our comfortable beds, perhaps we can appreciate anew the warmth, safety, and abundance that would seem miraculous to Thomas Fletcher and his family. And with that, close your eyes and drift off to sleep.